this afternoon, so I've agreed to deputise for him as chair. I'm sure we'll be fine. I've done this role a number of times, so it shouldn't be too painful for you all. Jen, just to very quickly say, are you recording? Good. So just let everybody know the meeting's been recorded, so you can watch that afterwards. And also, Jen's asked me to let you all know that at the end of the meeting, any documents we go across today will be uploaded to the Teams page. So you can download it afterwards if you need to, of course. I guess from me, before we get started and sort of ask you what you've all been up to, just a welcome really. And I guess to those I've not had a chance to say it to personally, still Happy New Year. I'm going to squeeze that in there. There's been so much going on in these first couple of weeks back at AWRC. It's quite remarkable actually on so many fronts, which we'll cover in the meeting today. We've got a stacked agenda actually today as well. And we've got folks from across the university and certainly from CRESR as well, going to sort of have a conversation with us about active travel, which should be really interesting. So quite a few things to go over. We're going to take you through a little bit about the AWRC 100-day plan as well, which should be really interesting, and some information later on from Sally around zero carbon, which looks really good. So we'll introduce that as well at the time. But before we get cracking, really, we're sort of a lot more detail about what's going on in the AWRC. Really, it's an opportunity to sort of look around this table we've got between us all and ask people what they've been up to, both personally and also professionally. So I guess without further ado, I'll scan the screen. And if anybody would like to give us an update on what they've been up to, feel free. Not seeing many hands out there. Suppose one thing I can throw into the mix. Oh, Shona, well done for rescuing the day. Over to you, Shona.
Hi, I was just going to say I'm reviewing for the European Research Council again, Horizon 2022. Thought they might change the name, but it seems to have the same name. And it's the technology and health call, and it's absolutely massive. I'm going to be kind of missing for the next 2.5 months. There's an enormous number of applications, but it gives you a real good sense of what's the state of the art pretty much in the world, because a lot of Americans join into these calls as well, in Israel, Australia, sometimes the Japanese. So it's a lot of work, but it's and it's fun because it's really cross-disciplinary, so it appeals to me.
Great, thanks for that, Sharon. It's really good. A quick one from my side. We've many of you have realised already we've actually launched the Next Stage Accelerator now. So with the support of obviously with Ryan, Debs, obviously Terry and Jamie, we've actually got that thing launched and we've got it funded externally as well. So the R&D is funded. The process is moving ahead of pace. We're having people apply already, and we'll have chosen our next cohort by the middle of February with an internal and an external panel of people reviewing that. So quite exciting times really. And you may all remember as well, it's not just about this early stage acceleration piece. It's about how we can take those pre-revenue companies and turn them into sort of larger companies down the stream and sort of keep that relationship going with them across the piece. So, you know, a really good opportunity for us, and you'll hear a lot more about that as time passes by. Okay, are there any other items anybody wants to pick up in terms of what people have been up to? Did everybody have a good Christmas, a good New Year? Happy to be back knowing that COVID's soon going to be leaving us, so we're here and we're going to be able to get back to some kind of normal, which will be wonderful. But yeah, okay, let's jump on to the next item. So I'm sure we'll eat up all this time really quickly as we plow through. The next agenda item is with our Amanda, and Amanda's going to give us an overview of what's new at AWRC. So Amanda, the floor is yours.
Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, great stuff. Okay, so phase 2 of BAM being on site. So those of you that have been in the building the last few days will have seen BAM up in our clinical lounge. This has already been communicated, but the dates were somewhat tentative before Christmas, but they're actually in now, and they're basically installing a fire curtain into that room, and works will be up until the 15th of February. So therefore, our lounge is out of action, and we've got waiting areas now on the landing outside room 3. Patients, visiting rooms 4, 5 and 6, they'll all be held in reception, and clinicians will be notified when they've arrived. And we're a few days in and we don't seem to have had any problems. But what we would like to do is, or like you to do, is if you are having visitors on site, and if it's any more than 3, is actually just let the operations team know, because we've only got so many chairs in reception, and it would really help us in terms of the flow of people around the building, know who's coming in, and then we can place people where we really need to. And I just thought it was a real opportune time just to remind everybody about the opening times for the building. So we're officially open 8 till 6:30. And I would ask everybody to adhere to those working times. If it's something you need to be in early for, then please have a conversation with myself. And everybody knows we did a questionnaire on behalf of BAM a couple of months ago. And I just thought we'd had a meeting earlier this week to look at some of the details in there and some analysis, and some of the, there was some really obvious comments in there, but one of them was this need for more flexible, smaller spaces for having Zoom calls or private calls, etc. The building and infrastructure team are looking at the moment at space utilisation. So we are very much keeping that in our mindset in terms of whatever spaces we repurpose will become more flexible. Of course, we'll not be able to answer everybody's desires, but we will try and, consider everybody's needs for moving forward. There was a query within that questionnaire about people, could they have calls in the office? And as you'll see, I'm sat in the office with my headset, and that's what we would recommend for people moving forward. We all know we all have so many meetings now, and this has just become standard practice. So yeah, that's just the request, is put your headset on. Another comment was about temperature in the rooms, which I think I addressed at either the last or the previous one, just to let you know that it is an airflow system, so it is pulling in cold air as well, and at the moment it's pulling in more cold air due to our current scenario. So sometimes the temperature gauges are always a bit misleading, so just take that, don't necessarily take it at face value. And I'm really pleased to say there were lots of positive comments in there. Friendly staff, front of house being our meet and greet for all our visitors, comments about helping people's well-being, moving more around the facility. So that was really positive as well. So there's more feedback to come, but obviously behind the scenes we're working on things, and I'll make sure that that's communicated as we go forward. COVID safe update. Well, we all know there are more changes to come, and we're just awaiting our latest update from Central SHU. So all the bullets underneath are things you've seen before, and that is as it is today, subject to updates coming through from Central SHU. Just probably the third one on there is about lateral flow tests. We do have a small stock on site here now. For those who work cross campus, you can pick up, I've been assured, but we do have supplies now on site at Hallam Help, and of course you can always order them to your home address. And it's all standard stuff that you should all know and be able to kind of quote in your sleep, in terms of don't come to campus with symptoms, report to chart team. We changed some of the operational aspects of kind of moving around the building just before Christmas, and that's still the same for today. Probably the one thing to pull there is you still need to continue your risk assessments, and if you want training, that's available on Core Portal. I just wanted to touch base about the new signing system, which has been received really well, and just to give some background about why we've implemented it. It's got multiple purposes actually in terms of why we're doing it, but of course we need to know who's in the building, if we did have an outbreak, so we could communicate to all. There is a request there to use the QR codes that are in all our meeting rooms if you're in there for more than 15 minutes, and that's a directive across the whole SHU campus. Of course, we are now just over 150 colocators, so we need to make sure space is available. In terms of the data, we'll be looking at this kind of moving forward in terms of what spaces are used. And of course, I know it's a very strange period, but moving forward as we kind of return to normal, that'll be really insightful for us. And also the system will be used as an asset if we did have an emergency situation. It won't be used in isolation. Obviously, our emergency services will do what they need to do. Our fire marshals on site have an activity to do as well, but it will be a very vital tool for them to use as well. And I just wanted to let everybody know that the data is confidential. So we have a number of users for the system, so that information is locked down. Just a request from myself, if you are bringing a group into the building for a tour, can you actually make me aware of it? Because ultimately we have events happening and then people walking through spaces. So that's one thing to try and challenge, but also depending on who's coming into the building, there might be other collaboration opportunities, and I can connect you with people who we perhaps should introduce your visitors to. So please, from now on, make sure you run past any tours with me. And just a general reminder about just general businesses, always book, use Connect2 to book a desk, then we know that you're coming in. And obviously you can use Connect2 for labs and so forth. Obviously talk to Ian if you've got any lab requirements. And also if you've got any consumable requests, have a conversation with Ian and make sure you've got budget in your projects. Health and safety is a real hot topic this month for me, actually. There are so many questions come out that I am like weaving my way through and learning. But I just thought it was just a good opportune time just to make you aware of a couple of things. So if in an emergency, you can use 888 on your desk phone, or you can use the black phones in the corridors, and they link straight to our central security office. In the instance of you need an ambulance, you can phone 888 and the central security team will assist the emergency services in getting here. So you don't need to worry about on the phone trying to give directions to them. They will do that on our behalf. And of course, you can always contact reception because all our reception staff are all first aid trained. And actually, we've got other first aiders. The first aid boxes all contain a list of people. And moving forward, we're going to have those displayed as well. I also wanted to let you know where our defibrillators are. We've got one at reception and we've got one in the physical activity suite. And all our first aiders, again, are all trained to use the devices. And first aid boxes, we've got 2 on the ground floor. There's one in the mail room, one in the kitchenette on the ground floor, and we've also got one on level 4 and 5. This is literally hot off the press on the back of a meeting this morning with the UTC. So actually I've done it opposite way around, but so literally from tomorrow, our parking arrangements with the UTC are going to change. I have got an email actually written that I'm going to hit send on immediately after I said these words. But essentially, we've been finding that the car park is full just after 8 o'clock, and it's predominantly UTC teaching staff because that's when they're in. And we opened this discussion before Christmas, and they've been really good in terms of acknowledging that that is the case. Just for everybody's knowledge, we share the car parking space. We've got 26 spaces each. So what we've agreed is the green zone in the middle, that will be used by UTC staff only. That's gone out as a comms today to them for them to basically to put in effect from tomorrow. So I would ask that we do the same, we take the same action. So the areas marked in red are actually allocated for ourselves. You'll see the bottom kind of right is the NHS bays. There is obviously the requirement that staff don't park in those spaces, and the kind of conditions alongside all this are in the email. We're going to use this as a pilot. So, you know, it's in everyone's interest to actually work with this, because we don't want to go down an avenue of having to book a permit every day. That's just way too complicated. So please try and work with it. We do have the overspill, which is only a few minutes walk away. You know, we should be practicing what we preach here at the AWRC. Let's use that. The email does give the kind of the do's and don'ts. And if anybody's got any comments, please feel free to come and talk to me. And I just thought I'd ought to let everybody know about some refurbishments that are going to happen in the car park soon. So we are going to have a new drop curb installed near the entrance to the facility. We're going to have some better signage installed for the disabled bays, because at the moment that's within the ground works and it isn't very visible. And we're also having a loading bay marked outside the building for when we have our deliveries, because sometimes with people parking alongside the building, our delivery trucks can't actually pull up. With regards to training, thank you to everybody for such a fantastic response. I've already got a first aid training set up for the 7th of February, and I've got a reserve list waiting at the moment. And if anybody else wants to join that reserve list, please, you know, just drop me a line and I'll get you added onto there. And then my next kind of task is to set up another fire marshal training session and get that here on site. So again, if that's something you would like to do, please get in touch. And it's basically an appeal really to get as many people first aid trained and fire marshal trained. It's just something I introduced from the last meeting of kind of who's new since we last met. So we've got a couple of new couple of new co-locators. So I've seen Alex on the call earlier, and Amanda, and everybody knows Alex. He's been around for a while. He just didn't get picked up in the chain of applications. And I'm going to just quickly hand over to Charmaine now.
Thanks, Amanda. Well, Amanda gave me this opportunity to reach out to particularly the ladies, lady co-locators, but also to any gentlemen who may have wives or partners who would be interested in participating in this MRC funded study. It has a background of investigating the causes and the risk factors for surgical site infection, particularly after cesarean section. And so this is a surgical procedure which has a very high infection rate, considering it's a relatively clean surgery and performed in healthy people. We've been undertaking studies in patients, and what we want to try and find out is the nature and the cause of the and the risk factors for women developing infection after this type of surgery. And what we want to do is to invite ladies to the AWRC clinical rooms to spend an hour having a rest on the surgical couches, and to try to find out the source of the small blood vessels that supply the skin to the abdomen. I think if any ladies or wives or partners of the male co-locators would be interested in participating in the study, if you could contact myself or my research assistant Harriet. There are these little posters dotted around the building, but if Amanda could just nip on to the next slide. This just gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're trying to do. We need another 20 ladies. We've already done recruited 20 ladies from around the AWRC, and I'm really grateful. You all know who you are, and thank you for participating, but we need at least another 20. So you'll be invited to have a lie down in the clinical room. And then in that first top slide, you see this is an infrared thermal camera, and we want to image the abdomen from the umbilicus to the bikini line to reveal hot spots on the thermogram. And what we want to try and do, because we know that these will be variable depending on different ladies, and then the next stage is to get a map of the abdomen and the thermal map, and then to test that what we see as hot spots actually represent blood flow. So we're using handheld Doppler to identify the most, if you like, the most active blood vessels to the skin, because our hypothesis is that those ladies after a cesarean section who go on to develop an infection have got some problem with the blood flow to the wound, and that's why it's not healing. So we want to do this in 60 altogether, healthy ladies, so that we get a map of the blood vessel sites and the location in healthy people before we can take it on to the bedside and to study people in after surgery. So if anybody's interested or would be willing to participate, it takes an hour, and we'd be really grateful if you could join us for an hour someday. We're usually available for the clinic rooms on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Fridays. So we've got 3 days out of the week, which we've kindly supported by AWRC. So thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Charmaine.
Hope to see you soon.
I can advocate, you know, it's not painful in any way. It's just a nice opportunity to lay down and have a nice chat with Charmaine and Harriet.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions in terms of the operations update?
That's great. Thanks,
No,
Amanda.
I'll hand back to you, Jason.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. And I don't think anybody's going to turn down and sit down with Charmaine in a nice chat where it's a nice warm room. That sounds all right to me. Thanks, Amanda, ever so much for that. And I'm sure we all feel very looked after by Amanda and the team. That update was really thorough. And I think it takes you through the amount of things that we're constantly trying to do at AWRC in this sort of iterative process to get to working practice, which is superb. I'd also just like to say, from my perspective, a welcome to our new co-locators, which Amanda announced. And also, you know, a really warm welcome to Shirley Sherwood, who's the co-chair of our PIRG, our Public Involvement Research Group. So welcome, Shirley. I know we had a quick chat before, but an official welcome from me as well. Okay, so the next agenda item we have to go through is a quick scan at our 100-day plan. Now, we're going to share this document, so obviously you'll have the opportunity to go through that in your own time anyway. So I won't spend too much time on it. It's just a quick 5-minute overview, but this is a document we do on a regular basis, so we can actually sort of corral and prioritize some of the sort of key things that we're doing as an organization. And I'll pick out a few as we go through actually. So looking at the sort of 30-day phase and what we're looking at here, the sort of things I'd like to sort of very quickly pick out is we've obviously got our market and communications plan. That's going to get reviewed and implemented after going through APG, and that's a big piece of work that Jen Parry's been doing. I think it's incredibly important because it covers both internal and external communications. And there are so many pieces of work that we do that needs to be coordinated from a comms perspective. So really good work taking place there. We're also going to be recruiting for the lead role for the training and education pillar. Those interviews are going to be taking place a week tomorrow. So we should very shortly have the lead in place for that pillar. And obviously that's something we've been getting around to for quite some time and is now being prioritized. That's quite an important thing that we're doing. We'll also see the first patients for the Active Together program with Yorkshire Cancer Research, obviously a very important piece of research for us as well. A couple of quick things in terms of 60 days, Jen, if you wouldn't mind just scrolling down a little bit, because I don't have control on that. Thank you very much. We're looking to get obviously the accelerator, the second accelerator is now in place. So that's actually launched. And we're recruiting to that program now as well. So that's an exciting piece of work. And we're also looking to get quite a substantial MOU signed with Canon Medical. Many of you have had some connection to this already because I've reported back in on a number of occasions. But that's exciting in terms of where Canon's going as an organization over the next 5 to 10 years and how we can work alongside them, not just with them as an organization, but with some of the stuff they're doing on site here with the Diagnostic Research Centre. Quite an exciting piece of work there as well. In terms of our 100 days and going forward, Jen, if you wouldn't mind just scrolling down from a little bit. Thanks ever so much. We were talking about this yesterday, actually, and one of the things we're looking to get in place is our community and EDI engagement strategy for AWRC in context of the civic framework. And it was an interesting conversation with Dave Hember on yesterday, actually, in the APG group meeting. We're also looking at our budgeting, of course, for 22-23 with college, which is going to be really important. That's our investment plan and our budgeting. We're looking at this whole idea of sort of what our investment propositions could be for the emerging levelling up white paper. And that white paper should hopefully be with us in about a month's time. Now, clearly that's an important thing for the university in general and college, but also hugely important for AWRC and what we might want to do around those areas. As I said, there's lots more stuff in there. So please do sort of take the time to have a look across the document that's going to be shared. Thanks, Jim. Feel free to stop sharing that now. I won't take questions on that because it's quite a short agenda item. Okay, our next agenda item, flying through our list rather rapidly, is a spotlight on active travel. And we've got Stephen Parks joining us from CRESR. So thanks ever so much, Stephen, for getting involved in this. It's really exciting, and active travel is a very important component for us. What I wouldn't mind doing very quickly, obviously, sadly that Maxine can't be with us, but as you said before, she's poorly. If we have Steve Haake on the line and Steve's listening in, I can see your photograph, Steve. I hope you're with us. Hi, Steve. Steve, if you wouldn't mind, just maybe 5 minutes setting a bit of context from the city region perspective and the role that you play before we pass over to Stephen, I think that'd be really valuable.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so I just moved out, so it's a bit better image. Yeah, thanks for that. So I didn't realise Maxine wasn't going to be here. So in terms of active travel, so you may know that we have an active travel commissioner for the South Yorkshire region. And the South Yorkshire region is now called the Mayoral Combined Authority of South Yorkshire. A bit long-winded. And that's Dan Jarvis. And he's just coming to the end of his 4-year term. And then we're going to be electing a new mayor in March. Sorry, in May, but PERDA starts in March. So this role of Mayor of South Yorkshire is a tricky one because in there you've got 4 local authorities, Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster and Sheffield. And those cities all have their own ideas of what they want to do. The one thing that the Mayor had control of was the transport strategy. And this transport strategy has led to an active travel strategy. And what we mean by that is how can we get people out of cars moving more often, and perhaps, you know, doing a commute via public transport, via, you know, walking, cycling. But in particular, what we find is that a large proportion of trips that people make, which are 1 kilometre or less, are made by car. And those 1 kilometre journeys are the ones that we're trying to get off the roads. Those are the ones where we could ask people to walk instead. So now there's all sorts of barriers to walking, to cycling, and walking is the starter for 10 for active travel. There's all sorts of barriers, like, you know, terrible pavements, bad crossings, bad crossing times, traffic that's just kind of zooming past all the time. So we have to make the environment better. So the Mayoral Combined Authority has been bidding for money, and it has money coming in now to spend on active travel infrastructure, and that is things like better pavements, better crossings, crossings on side roads, so that where a pedestrian, where a pavement comes along and then there's a side road and then a pedestrian pavement on the other side, we actually put in what's called something like a Dutch crossing or something, which raises the height of the road, so the pedestrian takes precedence with the zebra crossing. So there's things like that we now have money for in the city region, and things that are starting to go in. And you'd be pleased to know that actually the road going down through Attercliffe and down through Effingham Road is going to become an active travel route. So from the city centre, we'll have an active travel route coming all the way out and going to go all the way over, across to Darnall, to link the advanced manufacturing district to the city centre. And there's other places. We've got a bid in, an expression of interest for Darnall to become what's called a mini Holland, which is where you put some median road closures in, you enhance the environment, you put in greenery, etc., to make it a nicer living environment, so people come back out onto the streets. And there's kind of some people who are my age on the call who would remember being able to play out in the streets and playing Kirby with a football and doing all sorts of weird things that we used to be able to do, which you wouldn't dream of doing now because you'll get mown down. So it's trying to take, you know, to go back to some of those positive things that we had in years gone by. So in terms of, I think my phone is, hang on, let me decline that one. Sorry. So we have money coming into the city region. You know, it's tens of millions of pounds initially, but we've got a £2 billion spend over a 20-year period as a plan. I am active travel. I am the chair of the Active Travel Advisory Board. So I run an advisory board which supports the Active Travel Commissioner, which is Dame Sarah Story, and the person who do the donkey work, the manager, which is called Pete Zanzotera, or Pete Z as he's known. So there's a lot going on. Now, on the back of that, we have needed in recent times, as an advisory board, I pushed for us having monitoring and evaluation. So we put something in, we put a new set of cycle lanes in. Does it work? You know, does it work? Do people use it? What do people say about it? How does it improve health of those using it, etc.? So it's monitoring and evaluation. And both Steve and Maxine wrote the monitoring and evaluation plan. They tendered for it, they won the bids, and they wrote this fantastic monitoring evaluation plan. So that sets up for the city region in the future of how we will know whether any of these things that we are doing are any good. And there's other things that are coming from all this work. So for instance, yesterday I had a meeting with UKRI and a cycling, UK cycling, and I guess a product working group with Rally On It, Brompton Cycles, various small and medium enterprises that make bikes and make components for bikes, looking to set up a rather large grant with us as part of that. You know, a very large multi-million-pound grant looking at active travel and cycling and walking and so on. So there's lots of opportunities. Hopefully you kind of get that as a message. There's lots of opportunities. Steve is going to tell you about what he's up to. And for me, Steve and Maxine are real core components of this active travel. And I have to also add that they wrote the rapid review that we did for the Mayoral Combined Authority right at the start of all of this active travel, that effectively got us in there. That kind of rapid review got us in there and got us into the MCA and got me as chair of the advisory board and has cemented the relationship we have. Sorry, I probably went on a bit long there. Sorry.
Steve, that was great. Thanks ever so much. And really exciting to hear about some of the developments taking place in active travel in the city in general. I mean, as somebody who cycles to work always, you know, to know that that main road outside and Effingham Street is going to be, you know, put into a proper cycling is quite exciting. So that's great. Anyway, enough of me talking about my cycling. I'd really like to pass over to Steve Parks. Now, Steve's also going to step in for Maxine, and he's going to talk about the impacts of road space allocation and remodeling and active travel monitoring and evaluation. So Steve, without further ado, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jason. And yeah, thanks to Steve as well for that kind of great overview of what's going on in Sheffield and the region. I'm going to attempt to share some of my screen. Yeah, I thought that was a really good introduction into what's happening and all the sort of exciting developments, and you know, and that very much is a kind of, you know, off the back of the leadership that Steve's had around developing the sort of work around active travel and those really strong links to the city region. So which has been really important for us being able to kind of progress this work. I presume you can all see the screen okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about two different projects today. Maxine was hoping to be here, but she's not very well, unfortunately. So I'll cover off the presentation she was going to do around the monitoring and evaluation work that Steve mentioned. Won't do as good a job as her, but hopefully it'll kind of give you a bit of an introduction into it. But what I'll do firstly is just to talk around a different project that has recently ended. And this was called Room to Move, Impacts of Road Space Reallocation. And let me see. Here we go. So the background to this was that it was funded by something called the Decarbonate Network. And this is in turn funded by the EPSRC. So it's quite a big network, and as the name suggests, they're very focused on decarbonisation of transport and sort of have multiple strands to what they're doing. We responded, we being myself and a colleague, Tony Gore in CRESR, we responded to a call which was the kind of catchily titled Rapid Response Road Space Reallocation Funding Call, and which was kind of a small pot of money that was set aside to, at the start of the pandemic, to look in detail at some of the temporary measures that were introduced for active travel, so for walking, cycling and other active modes, to try and support people to do that, and also to kind of enable more social distancing at the time when it was kind of needed most. We were matched with colleagues from the University of Central Lancashire, and they kind of proposed a similar methodology, and the funders put us together, and this kind of helped them to meet their objectives around looking at place-based approaches to decarbonisation of transport. So that's kind of where we ended up with it. So we collaborated with some colleagues from UCLan, and the project ran between September 2020 and ended in October last year. So we were focused on a couple of local authorities. We had to partner with those local authorities in developing our proposal for it. They both ended up being quite hands-off. So we were with Sheffield City Council, and UCLan brought Lancashire to it. They ended up being, both being quite hands-off. They helped with some of the promotion around the survey we ended up doing, which I'll talk about later. But I think what the strength of taking the kind of two local authority approach was that we then looked at two kind of fairly contrasting study areas. So Lancashire is the county council, it's quite a dispersed population, lots of smaller urban centres, whereas Sheffield, obviously, we all know it pretty well, sort of more use of public transport, shorter travel times to larger employment centres. So sort of some interesting sort of contrasting elements to those places. So in terms of the objectives of this particular project, we wanted to look at trying to understand what the impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns were on travel behaviour in these areas, trying to evaluate the impact of the road space measures, so whether they encouraged shift towards more active modes, whether this was temporary or more permanent, and sort of trying to evaluate what the views were of these measures. And then we wanted to try and unpick what the longer term picture looked like. This was a little bit difficult given the kind of quite turbulent nature that we've of sort of transport in the last couple of years. But certainly something we were interested in looking at. The data that we collected was a 3-wave panel study. We had to conduct it fully online due to COVID, and also kind of resource limitations that we had, because it's quite a small pot of money that we did have. Our first survey was kind of our primary and most comprehensive survey. This was September and October 2020, and this looked at the kind of situation before, during and after of individuals in both areas. We got a pretty decent response to that, given it was kind of driven through our sort of own promotion and the promotion of the councils, and quite an even split between the two places. The second and third waves were a bit shorter, kind of follow-ups with the same people. So we had a sort of a lower response to that. Sheffield kind of did all right with that, actually. I guess the limitation of the work was that, again, because of the sort of limited resources, was that we had to use convenience sampling, and our preference certainly would have been for kind of a more comprehensive stratified random sampling approach across sort of the different postcode areas, but it wasn't possible, so we had to sort of take this approach, and that means we can't claim this to be representative of Sheffield, but it certainly gives us some really interesting insights. So just before I kind of go into the data a bit, I'll talk about the different measures. On the whole, the kind of measures implemented across the country were kind of quite similar. There was the sort of temporary active travel lanes, footpath widening, creating kind of no through roads, pedestrianisation and road closures. And we saw this play out in the two case study areas. Probably the only difference being the Kelham Island low traffic neighbourhood that some of you might have travelled through on the way to the AWRC, which is still in place now, and I think it's going to be made permanent, or certainly longer term anyway. So yeah, just to talk a bit about some of the findings that we had from this work. As I mentioned, the main survey captured behaviour focused on the first lockdown from March 2020, and then as things began to relax sort of in the summer of 2020. And this is what most of these charts focus on, but I'll touch on the longer term perspective as well. We saw a greater proportion in Sheffield changing their behaviour in lockdown 1, particularly for commuting and leisure trips, but also for shopping as well, and sort of to a lesser degree Lancashire. And then in terms of trips, obviously we were expecting these to have gone down during the lockdown as kind of our mobility decreased, and we sort of all stayed at home a lot more. And this was shown in the data as well, particularly commuting and shopping trips, although for leisure trips, they did increase a bit. And then after the first lockdown, we kind of saw it begin to kind of get back to pre-pandemic levels, although at the time we did the survey, it wasn't quite back at those points. And then in terms of changes to where people actually travelled to, we also observed changes to where people would normally go, and certainly this was more pronounced in Sheffield. So 3/4 of our respondents reported changes to their usual destinations for trips like going shopping or leisure. And then we looked at the kind of post-lockdown picture, and whether there was a return to normal. And so interestingly, we saw that 14% of people in Sheffield did return to their kind of pre-lockdown habits, but half maintained the changes that they were doing. during lockdown. So, you know, there wasn't a kind of instant return to normality for people. And then the kind of remaining 37% actually made subsequent changes after lockdown. So sort of, you know, there was even more sort of churn in where people were traveling to. And then just thinking about commuting, obviously one of the key journeys that we make. Obviously there was a kind of much more prevalence around people working from home around this point. Comparing the two areas, so this shows us the kind of before, during and after picture of lockdown 1. We can see that in Lancashire, it's car use and van use much more prevalent. And I think it's really a reflection of the more dispersed nature of these areas, and the kind of, it mirrored the existing transport trends that we knew were happening there. But the changes were more pronounced in Sheffield compared to Lancashire, particularly if think about those travelling by active modes only, or using active modes in combination with other kind of modes such as the car. We did see kind of more fluctuations in Sheffield, and as we'd expect, public transport was a big loser in both places, but particularly in Sheffield, where public transport use was higher pre-pandemic, owing to the kind of spatial structure of the area. And then just onto shopping trips, much more stability for this in terms of kind of private car use. So there wasn't a lot of churn in those in that mode, but certainly saw increases in active travel. Again, with the changes more pronounced in Sheffield. One kind of notable change was those using active modes only in Sheffield. There's around 10% reported that for shopping trips before the lockdown, and then during the first lockdown, this was up to 23%. So quite a jump in kind of people, you know, leaving the car at home, not travelling by public transport, understandably, but going around using active modes only. Obviously, we're quite interested. You know, we're really focused on active travel, and we looked at those who didn't travel actively before lockdown. So they sort of, for these 3 journeys, so commuting, shopping, and leisure, they didn't report using an active mode to make these journeys. So presumably travel much more by car. And this showed that particularly with shopping and leisure trips, there was quite a big uptake of walking for those that hadn't previously done so. As Steve mentioned in his introduction, you know, walking is kind of the key kind of behaviour that we're focused on and trying to increase, particularly kind of for more local journeys. But cycling also increased as well, but to a slightly smaller degree. And it kind of shows how this dramatic shift in the status quo during lockdown prompted previously sort of non-active travellers to try out more active modes. And then I mentioned we were interested in what impact the measures had. And we asked respondents what their awareness of the measures were. You know, it'd be interesting to know of the people on the call, kind of what, how many people kind of engaged with one of the temporary measures, or if there was sort of, they weren't necessarily aware of them. In Sheffield, 88% reported being aware of at least one of the measures. But of those who actually went on to use those, this was down to 41% in Sheffield, so sort of quite a difference. It was actually worse in Lancashire as well, and I don't know if that's again a reflection of the sort of more dispersed nature of that job, that environment, as opposed to Sheffield. And obviously that makes us think, well, why weren't people using these measures? What were those barriers to them? And when we asked that question, over half were not actually served by the measures themselves. A lot of them were around the city centre. There were others, places like Broomhill, and obviously like Kelham Island, but in terms of the core, you know, a lot were there. And I think the fact that many were working from home or staying more local meant that they actually just didn't have the chance to engage with them. But there were also kind of over a quarter didn't actually regularly walk or cycle, so they weren't even in a position to use the measures. So it kind of gives us an idea of what the engagement might actually look like. And then we're also quite interested in what the views of these measures were. Again, kind of colleagues will kind of have their own views on them and how effective they were. As you can see, kind of overwhelmingly positive from the participants we spoke to. The Shalesmore, the bottom bar is the Shalesmore temporary path, which you may know was quite contentious. It was covered quite a lot in the press, and this was this sort of had the kind of was more likely to have kind of sort of poor or fair views around it as opposed to excellent or good, and you do kind of wonder what impact maybe the press coverage might have had on that, and in terms of kind of influence of people's views, or whether it was just sort of not conceived well. But overall, kind of a really positive story, which is nice to see. And then just on the longer term picture, this is a little bit difficult to kind of draw conclusions with, because although we had the 3-wave panel, just because of the nature of kind of this kind of survey and the attrition we had, our sample, the subsample is quite small. It's for Sheffield, it was 167 respondents. So it is, but I'll kind of touch on it briefly. And what we can kind of observe with this is a real drop off across all the modes in terms of their use. And I think, again, this may be a reflection of that kind of reduction and tightening of our mobility and our ability to kind of travel places during lockdown. But we kind of see those as lockdown is lifted, we kind of see us returning more towards those pre-pandemic levels, but not quite yet. Public transport still very low, but private car and cycling returning a bit more quickly than the others. So this was for commuting, and then just on shopping, which is another key mode. Again, with the exception of public transport, the levels were, amongst this particular subsample, were quite stable. Active travel kind of dropping off again amongst this group. Public transport still really, really low and not quite recovered. If we kind of looked at this maybe, a year later again, maybe we'd see public transport a bit more positive, and some different changes, but this was the limit of the survey. And then, just a quick summary on this. So some of the key findings that we had: more pronounced behaviour change in Sheffield, particularly in relation to those increasing their use of active travel or active travel with combinations of other modes. So that kind of multimodal dimension, as opposed to kind of solely just travelling by car, maybe people trying out active modes a little bit more. Evidence of sustainment of the shifts to where we normally travelled after that first lockdown. So kind of indicating that the lifting of restrictions didn't necessarily lead to a kind of rapid charge back to our pre-pandemic habits. And the fact that proximity to temporary measures was low, because this kind of meant that people didn't really have the chance to use them, despite awareness of them being quite high. But those who did rated them quite positively. And we did see that measures that removed traffic from where people were kind of so places like the Pinston Street pedestrianisation were kind of most highly rated by people. And then, just sort of active travel has become kind of quite popular around leisure trips. But again, that kind of challenge of public transport being still being really low. And then in terms of kind of some next steps for this particular work, we delivered the report to the funder at the end of last year. We're now looking at the kind of journal articles and trying to maybe conduct some further analysis of the survey data. So quite interested in looking at the spatial dimensions, given kind of that issue around proximity to measures, looking at where people's journeys were and sort of how close they might have got to them. And then also exploring questions around the kind of wider decarbonisation agenda and the links to active travel with that, given the kind of background of the funder as well. So I'll take any kind of happy to take some questions if there are any on that particular project. Give me a quick breather before launching into talking about the monitoring and evaluation project.
Looks like we have a question from Shona. Shona, over to you.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for this. Nice to see. Always thought it might be nice to live in Lancashire, and then I have a friend up there now who sends winter pictures back, which kind of turns me off a bit. But did you assess whether the people had any disability or, physical limitations?
Short answer, no. We did kind of collect some socio-demographic questions, and we looked at kind of access to vehicles and things like that. But I'm not sure we asked that question. We might have done that. Sorry if it's a while since I looked at the survey.
No, it's
certainly
okay.
Something, I think one of the challenges we had was that balance of keeping the survey short enough to not put everybody off without. But yeah,
because I live in an old pit town, and the level of disability, even in younger people, is always surprisingly high. I'm always a bit, Okay, thanks.
Steve, a question from you.
Quick question from me. So, Steve, so first question, will you come and present that to the advisory board in a few weeks' time? That would be great. And when you present that, what is the advice that you'll be giving Dame Sarah Story? What would you say?
Off the top of my head, I suppose it's kind of the confidence that the measures introduced kind of maybe on the whole were sort of viewed quite positively and well received. So ignoring that kind of vocal minority, maybe that might be quite against the change in the measures. I suppose this is the kind of slight difficulty in that these were measures to reduce to improve social distancing and places that were busiest, but I think it's the fact that there are maybe kind of missed opportunities in more suburban areas that could have kind of if we were able to introduce measures there, they might have been used a bit more and kind of start to kind of drive a bit of momentum towards implementing more of these ideas, because they're fairly low cost, some of them, especially kind of temporary. But a real advantage of putting something in that's temporary is that you can always offer to take it away, but you can, the longer it's there, the more people get used to it, perhaps. So it's kind of that bit of trial and error, really. But I think it's the confidence that on the whole the measures were kind of well received.
Brilliant, really good. Thank you, Steve. That's really good.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Steve. So, Steve, you're going to jump onto the next presentation for Maxine.
Yeah. So
could I ask you limit it to between around 5 and 10 minutes? It's just I know time's pushing on. We've got another agenda item after. Don't give me too much, but just to give you an indication.
That's music to my ears, really, because I've only just had sight of this presentation, so you'll have to forgive me for sort of skipping through it a bit. And I guess I'd add that if there's any, I'm sure there might be questions and clarifications needed for this bit. So you can always get in touch with Maxine or myself. So Maxine kind of led on this and certainly is the sort of expert around the monitoring and evaluation. Steve gave a little bit of an introduction into this. And this is kind of the sort of culmination of a lot of work by the MCA in South Yorkshire. So we started this work late 2020. It was quite short. It was to the end of March 2021. And what I'll talk a bit about now is kind of the process that we went through in developing it, some of the things that we tried to kind of build into that. I guess the first thing is the need for monitoring and evaluation around this. As Steve mentioned, kind of being able to evidence the impact of investments in active travel is really important, and it's something that is kind of quite surprisingly underdone. It rarely exists, and a lot of this is to do with resource. So we kind of wanted to think about, how we actually can understand and measure impact, what might need to change. you know, where do we actually start? So we did a lot of looking at other places, other regions, reviewed the evidence there, and the summary really, you know, and also looked within the region and what data existed to help us kind of monitor, begin to monitor what was happening around active travel. And I suppose the kind of summary, the short answer around that is it's very patchy, very ad hoc, and often kind of falls by the wayside. So some of the areas that we were focusing in on in terms of trying to kind of how we would examine impact, and the kind of change we wanted to measure, we were looking at things around activity levels, so levels of walking and cycling and other active modes, the kind of social impact, so increasing well-being, thinking about safety, you know, how many injuries and serious accidents and deaths were associated with cycling, and things like environment, health, and the economy as well. So these were the kind of areas that we were focusing in on, and I think that recognises that, you know, the sort of broad impact of active travel and why this is such a sort of exciting area. The opportunity, so why now? Why is it important to push forward with the active travel and to effectively monitor and evaluate the investments that were going in? So it's that post-COVID opportunity for change, and the fact that you know, there's a clear business case with investing in active travel, but it's important to have further evidence that, and it helps with that kind of longer term planning as well. So you know, Steve mentioned that kind of 20-year funding plan, you know, that doesn't, you know, having that sort of security, even though a lot of it isn't in place yet, you know, having that longer term plan is really important in terms of delivering something that is coherent and comprehensive across somewhere like the South Yorkshire region. So some of the priorities we were looking at, it's things around a quality evidence base, something that is flexible in terms of a monitoring evaluation plan that can be reviewed and refined, where there are clear responsibilities and an understanding of what the capabilities are and where the gaps might be. And then it's thinking about the different audience that we might need to target. So, you know, and what the M&E plan would need to capture. So this is across kind of the users and the public, what they might need, what they might benefit from, and what information might need to be gathered, and also across the SCR or the South Yorkshire MCA now, and then society and wider stakeholders as well. I won't go through this all, but this is effectively our version of the logic model for the project, and it was thinking about why change is needed, what the kind of issues and consequences of this are, and kind of what kind of change is required. And then it's kind of going back to those 6 areas, what kind of targets might be needed, might be realistic, and then the kind of outcomes we would be looking to monitor as well. And then in terms of actually how we operationalise all this, so the city region had, or the MCA had their active travel implementation plan, so they had their vision for what was going to go where, when it was going to go there, how it was going to be funded, and a real kind of ambitious long-term plan. And then, you know, with the M&E plan alongside that, we were interested in, you know, it was important to kind of think about how we can actually make this work. So it's setting aside the money to do this. Often there isn't the kind of money to do the monitoring and evaluation, identifying who would lead on this, who would have the responsibility, making sure the data collected across the different local authorities was standardized and using the same approach, and sort of identifying who would lead on this as well. And then just last couple of slides, what we kind of how we ended up framing this was looking at the kind of bronze, silver, gold, and this was the short to longer term. So the bronze being the kind of basic core things that needed to be put in place, that kind of standardization of data, you know, collecting the basics, and sort of meeting those kind of, you know, core targets. And then as the silver and gold develops over time, with more investment, trying to kind of build up our ability to gather data and to measure impact and sort of contribute to the evaluation of it as well. And then I'll just talk about the next steps very briefly. In terms of kind of within SHU, it was kind of trying to build on this work that we've done to try and kind of draw in more colleagues into this work, sort of expand collaborations and funding. And then for the city region, for the MCA, very much about kind of getting this plan out there and getting the buy-in from it and kind of putting those basics, the bronze level in place early on, and taking it from there and seeing it as kind of an iterative process as you sort of develop the monitoring evaluations, things progress. But given, you know, what Steve said around the kind of the election in the summer, in the spring, and, you know, the sort of, I guess, a bit of uncertainty around it also, there's a bit of a wait and see in terms of where this actually goes. But yeah, we've kind of delivered our part of it now. And then I'll just talk briefly. This is kind of, you've heard about a couple of projects that we're working on, or we have worked on, and Steve kind of laid that groundwork around all the exciting things happening in Sheffield and in South Yorkshire. And something Maxine and I, supported by Steve, have been working on is kind of looking at establishing an active travel research group or something like that within the university. And this kind of reflects that growing interest in active travel across different areas, policy, practice, academia, and the fact that there are more opportunities for collaboration and funding kind of coming through. And we're keen to kind of make this into a bit more of a formalized group, because I'm aware that there's lots of people working on this, whether kind of directly or indirectly through their work. So I guess it was just leaving you with a couple of quick requests from us. Firstly, if you want to kind of be part of this group, and I can't stress enough, it's quite early days, but, you know, we're kind of effectively sort of looking to audit what is out there within the university. And also, as we go through that process, you know, we're really keen to hear about examples of relevant projects, expertise that can be built into this sort of emerging research group. So please do get in touch if you've got any thoughts or any suggestions, or would like to kind of be kept informed about how this progresses. But we're looking to kind of move forward quite quickly with this now. So yes, hopefully the M&E presentation was coherent enough, but if you've got any questions, do let me know.
Steve, that was great. Thanks ever so much. As a cyclist, as somebody who actively travels most times when I come into AWRC, it's great to know we've got that level of granularity in our research to actually support our propositions going forward. So that's great to see. And picking up on Rachel's point very quickly about the mayoral election taking place, obviously in May this year. You'll probably know there are Labour candidates, there are Green Party candidates, there's even a Yorkshire Party candidate. I've heard active travel talked about a lot from a number of the candidates. I think it's a mixed bag from what I can tell, so we'll see who gets elected. But I'd be very surprised if it wasn't a Labour candidate. Steve, you had a question.
Yeah, and answer to Rachel's question, the mayor could scrap active travel and just go, no, not interested. But to be honest, they haven't got a lot else to play with as a mayor. Yeah. So they'd be really stupid to get rid of it because they haven't got a lot else to do. So just in terms of Steve's plea about active travel expertise, we are really looking for skills, and there could be anything. It could be technological, it could be tracking, it could be monitoring of phones, it could be image tracking. So for instance, we need to know how many people actually walk down a pavement when a pavement is installed, how many people use cycle lanes, what's the impressions of people of their cycling lanes, you know, surveying and so on. Policy, social policy is important. So it's anything from the technical to the policy. So it's really, really wide and broad. So if you think something you're doing might be interesting to us, please do let us know, because I can guarantee there's going to be some money flowing in this direction.
Great, thank you, Steve. Steve, would you mind just stopping sharing the screen? Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. So again, just a huge thank you to Steve for coming along, and it's great to know that sort of CRESR on site or Colocator with us are doing that level of research, which is wonderful. We press on in time, and sort of handling my job as chair, effectively, I want to make sure we get time for all the presentations we have. The next one we have looks at zero carbon on population health and well-being. From our perspective as an AWRC, this is kind of split into two areas. We have the sort of research agenda of that, which obviously Sally's heading up and we'll be speaking to shortly. And there's also a building agenda. So I'd see sort of Amanda Brothwell and Claire and the infrastructure group handling that side of it in terms of implementation into the building. So an exciting time and a really important agenda. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sally Fowler Davis. The floor is yours, Sally. You're on mute.
Sorry, first thing wrong. I'm a bit conscious of putting up another slide deck, and I just wonder if I could ask that people really actively write into the chat around this agenda during my presentation, because I think this is, whilst we are locating this ambition in the Systems, Services and Strategy Research Programme, which is one of the 2 programmes and 5, well, with the 3 themes, it really is an agenda for everyone. It's like public health, it's everybody's business probably. So whether or not you're interested in the research side, or whether or not you're interested in the building side, or whether you're just interested in making yourself aware of what's going on, I hope to just sort of canter through a set of ideas for you just to sort of set this up, and hopefully we'll be coming back to it on regular occasions. I also wanted to, I didn't realise that Peter was going to be here, so I want you to know that Peter Wells is setting up a Centre for Sustainability and Climate in Shoe, and I know you've got to leave quite quickly. Peter, is there anything you want to just say at this point, or just introduce the centre?
Yeah, so yeah, I think many of you know me, and it's good to see you. It's good to see Steve here. I've not seen for ages. We are setting up a centre, not just a research centre, but kind of across the business engagement, teaching and learning portfolios, primarily based in Department of Natural and Built Environment, which includes a whole load of some environment-related sciences, policy and planning work, but it's also intended to be a hub. I've been talking a lot to Rob about lessons from the AWRC for this, as how you work across the university, and he's been really, really helpful, as you can imagine. Looking at expertise across the university, so not least in your own areas, but also in MERI and NCFI, and in areas like art and design. So really excited to be developing this, and probably come back and talk some more, but I want to not steal any more of Sally's thunder, and so back to Sally. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I don't know that anybody, I think this is everybody's business. So as I said, so really happy to collaborate on this. And one of the things I want to say at the get-go really is that it's quite difficult to talk about this issue. I find it quite emotional in a way to talk about this issue. And for many people who are talking about climate change, there's a very high degree of worry at the moment. There's worry in our student group. There's worry just across society generally about whether or not we're going to achieve the sort of response to the environmental emergency that is going to be possible over the next 10 years. And the next 10 years seems to have been now identified as the critical time for us to make a real difference in terms of reducing the heat, reducing the temperature in the climate, and therefore getting back onto an even keel. Anyway, but all of those things are so huge to think about and to understand that actually I'm a great believer in bringing it right back to very local activity. And so one of the things I really want to talk about today is the sort of emergency itself, but then finish with some real practical stuff that we'll be doing, and particularly some research initiatives around the health and care system. So by all means, please put in the chat and as much as you can, and that's our audience participation. So the first thing to say is establishing the principles based on the scientific evidence of global warming and the real need to decarbonise to reduce fossil fuel emissions. One of the issues that I have politically, I suppose, is that we talk a lot about net zero, and net zero means that we reduce carbon from the atmosphere. particularly by capturing carbon. Whereas actually really what most scientists are talking about now is for the politicians to take on the idea that we really do need to reduce carbon usage and particularly fossil fuel emissions. So we'll all be aware of the fact that temperatures are warming, that unless we get somewhere close to this 1.5 degree warming and reduction of that, currently we're on a target for about 3.5, and that's well thought now that there's going to be that would create catastrophic and irreversible damage within the next 10 years. Now, most of what we see happening in terms of fires and floods and temperature increases are happening, across the world, the other side of the world. And I often say to people, it's when Bangladesh goes underwater that we'll really start to change our minds about really what's going to happen. And I'll go on to that in just a moment. So the IPCC is the intergovernmental planning, and if you look at this list of systems and ideas that are going to be affected by climate change and which are absolutely the sustainable development goals internationally and across the globe, it is again a sort of bewildering really, and I think it's this all-encompassing systems view that we need to perhaps wrap our heads around. What I tend to do is I look at the ones that are kind of closest to me and closest to what I can do something about. So clearly my focus through my career has been on good health and well-being, so number 3. And a lot of what I'm going to say in the next couple of slides is about our interface and our work in research with enabling and improving health and well-being and using the environmental levers that we have to do that. But for lots of other arts, we're very engaged in reducing inequalities, which is number 10, or the industry and innovation infrastructure that will no doubt contribute to some of the changes that we want to see. And of course, personally and in our own lives, there'll be lots of people who are already taking climate action or looking at peace and justice initiatives or gender equality initiatives. So this really does come home to your own personal choices, I think, in lots of ways about how we respond. So we're just talking about our work situation for now. So going into the agenda about health is obviously a key focus. And for quite a long time now, the Royal College of Physicians has been doing work just to really try and make people aware of the interface between the health emergency and the climate emergency. So already this kind of flow diagram I think is really helpful, and it's part of a series that you can just click onto and is on YouTube if you are interested in joining the dots, if you like, between ecosystem collapse and agriculture and respiratory disease and all these other things. But the ones that are particularly notable are how climate change is already causing between 250,000 additional deaths per year, and that's not including additional activity that is global. That's actually figures from just the United States. So we know that there are really significant effects now of the drying climate, the heat intensification really right across the world. And these were, first of all, accepted within the Paris Climate Agreement and the potential for larger gains in COP. And I went to COP along with David Swan from the university, and it was an incredibly disappointing event. It was one of those events that was so full of PR people that you kind of wondered if anything was ever going to get done. And it has now given way to the need for another COP, which is going to be COP27, which is next year in Egypt. And I think people left that global opportunity feeling very disappointed and very tired of people trying to facilitate this net zero ambition as opposed to zero carbon. That's a very important sort of factor. So one more slide on the sort of devastating effects of climate emergency. Probably no apologies for that from me, but sorry to bang on. One can become a bit of a crazy ranty person when you start getting into this, and I'll try not to. But I think one of the things that has been particularly important for me is the links between health and population impact. So what's very clear within the climate emergency is the inequalities between the global north and the global south. So in many ways, the very simple argument is in the north, we use the carbon, and in the south, they suffer for it. Because there's no question that our use of carbon is massively greater than in any other population in the south. But I often think about this in terms of some of the structural inequalities that also exist in Sheffield between the east and west. So the idea here that I'm putting is that climate shocks and ongoing global warming has a disproportional effect on vulnerable communities. And I know that even from just doing recently some work just around in Darnell, and people talking about how difficult it was for them to manage asthma with their children when they live next door to one of the biggest trunk roads, which links beautifully back to the active transport issues. So health inequalities could be reduced by addressing the climate emergency. And particularly looking at women and children and those from diverse ethnic groups is part of all of our research activity. And I'm proposing perhaps that we could make that more figural in our work. So what can be done, what is being done, and what we're doing at the moment. So just as a result of suggesting this climate fresque workshop, we're going ahead with that with 10 people, 10 colocators have signed up to a 3-hour workshop, which is going to be a trial, one of the 2 trials across the university, to see whether or not this awareness and understanding of climate change is something that people would really value, and how that's part of, if you like, the transition, what we call the just transition from people doing things in their usual way. We talk a lot about behavior change, don't we? And then people doing things in different ways in order to live within this notional allowance of carbon that we can give ourselves on a yearly basis, and just reducing our carbon footprint, really. So this idea of this climate fresque is a face-to-face, or it is actually going to be an online workshop. And what it does is very similarly, it sort of joins up all these factors, all the complex relationships between agriculture and industry and carbon, and what the effects are on and how to understand global warming. But it doesn't leave it at that. It actually goes on to really help people to think through what they can do and also what their emotional response is to it. This is being really, really widely rolled out across European universities now. And in fact, the reason it's a fresque is because it's a French company that run it. But we're really hoping that this 3-hour workshop would be an acceptable way for people to kind of understand really kind of fundamental things about even how the university changes its policies, perhaps associated with closing buildings or rewilding certain parts of our infrastructure, or starting to think about how we facilitate and enable some of our students to incorporate climate change and climate activity within their curriculums. So the climate fresque will happen on the 4th of February, and we'll evaluate that, and that'll be the first one, and then very much feed that back through into Peter's work within the university, and look at how we roll that out perhaps across the whole piece. I should say there are other really good methods for learning about climate action, and one is called climate literacy. But the university is actually signed up now with COP to be one of the to look very carefully about how we invest in and change our carbon footprint over the years. And part of that is about knowledge and awareness right across our workforce and our student groups. So it's just the beginning of that. But the second thing I wanted to mention was a very particular bid that will go in May. I will I don't know if I'll lead it or co-lead it, but it's going to be a bid with Yorkshire, the whole of Yorkshire and Humberside, Kent, Surrey and Sussex. And the idea is that we'll co-develop a complex method, a digital method for impact evaluation of the changes that are being made through the NHS. So people might know that the NHS has a green policy and has had monitoring of decarbonisation for something like, well, 2008, it was mandated as a legal entity that we needed to look at our carbon measurement in the NHS. And so there's a very, very significant need now to really look at direct use of carbon and indirect use of carbon. So you'd be interested to know that 1 in 3 short journeys within this city, within Sheffield, are for health purposes. So these short trips to the GP or short trips to go for a walk but you start with your car, and I'm guilty of that as anybody, are really part of our thinking about how do we change the whole net zero component of the NHS. So there's a very significant piece of work to be done. The green plan is going in now, and right across the country, these plans are being made at local level. Some of us might have been even involved in those. And what we're proposing here is a national digital evaluation that incorporates a carbon calculator, but also incorporates some health and wellbeing outcomes. So that's an interesting opportunity and a big bid that we'll do with a number of big partners. But I did want to bring in something about the buildings and spaces, and Amanda mentioned this at our last Colocators meeting. We do want to do some more local activity, and obviously anybody who would want to be involved in that should. Amanda, I don't know if you want to say something about this slide. I'd be happy for you to, if you're there still.
I am, Sally. Yeah, I'm here. I mean, essentially, I have organised a meeting on the 9th of February at 1 o'clock. So if anybody wants to come and join us with any great ideas or just wants to listen to what everybody else says, you're more than welcome. Please just get in touch. But as we mentioned at a previous meeting, you know, there are some really simple, easy things we can do within the building, which are kind of, you know, turning the lights off when we leave a room. Yes, they are on sensors, but they're not immediate. Adjusting the heating control so we have a kind of constant temperature around. Yep, using our terrace, you know, I'd be interested to hear from if anybody's got any key ideas there. I think at this stage we just want to absorb anything you can contribute. Come to the meeting, share your ideas with us. As I say, 9th of February at 1, or if you want to know more, just drop me a line.
Thank you, Amanda. I think it would be really great to see as many people there as possible. You're not going to be committed to anything, but I think it just is something about demonstrating our commitment within the AWRC to some of these activities. And I should say we're not ahead in this at all. In actual fact, there are certain areas across the university, other colleges who've employed climate champions, students are climate champions, and are already doing much more work around this. Certainly, BGAN has been leading on a global initiative around climate literacy for probably 2 or 3 years, and Owen Anthony's as well from Estates is very keen to see how we can integrate the climate agenda with the Estates agenda for the university and strategically. So that would be really good to know. I did have to put Leonardo DiCaprio in this, Jason. I'm sorry about that. He's a bit of a fave of mine. And people will have seen this film, perhaps or not, on Netflix. It's a very interesting and got loads of traction, not because it's a particularly great film artistically, although the cast is brilliant, but it does really speak to the idea of how difficult it is to talk about and start acting around changing your behaviours in terms of carbon decarbonisation, and how difficult it is to talk about that on the, you know, at a political level, much as a local level. So we just wanted to reintroduce this, say that there's definitely going to be a research agenda. We definitely want our PIRG, our public involvement in research group, to start asking our researchers questions about the carbon neutrality of their research bids. And we really want to kind of start thinking about this in terms of the equality and diversity issues.
Right, thank you.
So
Thank you,
that's a
Sally.
quick picture of Lucy, who's not been able to be here today, and our system. And I'll take our thing down now.
Thanks, Sally. That was a great presentation. Sorry to rush a little bit. We're just getting a bit tight on time. Perhaps if I could ask people if they have any questions for Sally to send them directly across afterwards, just because we're very short on time and I don't want to keep people over time. A very quick AOB, which you may have seen from Claire Woodward in the chat there. Closure saying that an annual review was produced for PERG at the end of last year, and she'll share this for review. And there's a target to review 50% of new project proposal in 2022 through the PERG. So please get in touch if you're developing a proposal, and we can paper-based or live reviews. Beyond that, in terms of AOB, a few quick ones before we finish. Some will know, some won't know. We're in the middle of a production of an AWRC promotional video. It includes lots of our Colocators, and I saw a pre-production version this week, and I can honestly say it's exceptional. So I can't wait for that to come out and for everybody to look at it, because it's a wonderful promotional tool. But I think it also exemplifies what we are as an AWRC. And I have to say, Claire Parkinson is an absolute natural in front of camera. She's got another career and she wants it. She's wonderful. Just a heads up as well about the fact we've got an Olympic anniversary plans coming up for the 10-year anniversary of the Olympic Games in 2012, and a working group has been formed at AWRC around that. Rob asked me to convey as well about the fact movement of government COVID guidelines and how they're changing rapidly. So we'll be keeping an eye on that and sort of supporting folk back on site with guidance as that takes place a little bit further. We've got a couple of quick minutes. Does anybody get any AOBs they'd like to pick up before we close the meeting? I'm just looking down the slides now.
Just a quick one, Jace.
Yeah, please do, Ryan.
Yeah, my camera's not done the flap. That's another issue that sometimes get. Yeah, just a quick thank you for some researchers that have been really proactive in bringing potential companies for the accelerator forward. These are ones that they're already working with already. Potentially could work with some more, and we might be able to fund them through the program. So keep them coming.
Brilliant, thanks, Ryan. And by the way, just reading the chat there again, I can say Claire Boot or Claire Main Prize was very good, of course, but I've got to say, I think Claire Parkinson could actually be a children's BBC presenter tomorrow morning. She's that good. She's exceptional. Okay, so if there are no more AOBs, let's bring the meeting to a close. I think it's a good indication of how well the meeting went that we had about 36 people left a few minutes ago from about 40 odd. So that's always a good sign. I don't know about you guys, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And thanks for treating me gently as chair. It's been a real pleasure. So we'll close it there, and thanks everybody for your time. Speak
Thanks,
soon.
Jason.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.